Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this hybrid meeting on charting a path to prosperity, Sri Lanka's journey from debt to growth. I'm Dirk de Velde. I'm the Director of International Economic Development here at ODI. This is a hybrid meeting. It's streamed online, and there are about 100 people online, and there's some people here in the audience, and we're still waiting for one or two speakers to join as well. So welcome to this meeting. It's a follow-up on a meeting that we organized about 18 months ago when Sri Lanka was in a deep downturn and in a big crisis, and we hosted a panel here to discuss the challenges. And now we have made use of the last sort of half year of the fact that my dear friend and colleague Ganesh Vitnaraya has become appointed a visiting senior fellow here, and he's based in Colombo and also London, to work on Sri Lanka and really working on the crisis, recovery, and also really thinking about a range of policies to deal with the crisis and to come fast of the crisis than otherwise would have been the case. And we're working on trade policy, fiscal policy, on sort of using international experiences of dealing with private sector bondholders, for example, and also learning from other examples. And we've got a fantastic panel to discuss the issues in Sri Lanka, both from here and also online. And soon we will be joined by the High Commissioner from Sri Lanka here to London, and His Excellency Rohita Bogolagama. He will join us in about 20 minutes or so, and he will give us a keynote to think about government priorities. We'll soon start with a discussion by Ganesh Vitnaraya, who will set the scene and will talk us through where are we now in Sri Lanka, 18 months after the previous meeting. Are we now in a bit more positive, having got more positive circumstances now? And we will then also hear from a private sector perspective, and when he's available soon, Fernando, who's the CEO of MAS Holdings, will give us a private sector view on how he sees and how the private sector sees the recovery. We'll then have a number of discussions from key experts who are absolutely fantastically knowledgeable about Sri Lanka and being Sri Lankan themselves as well. We will hear from Indrit Kumaraswamy, who's the former central bank governor in Sri Lanka. We will also hear from Sharmini Kure, who will join us shortly, who's the former director of the Institute of Capacity Development at IMF. And then we'll also hear from Professor Shanta Devarajan, who was on our board at ODI, but is now the professor of the practice of international development at Georgetown University. And he, as well as Sharmini and Indrit, are also advisors to the government in Sri Lanka. And then we'll hear from Phyllis Papa-David, who is a senior research associate at ODI, learning from some other cases as well. For example, the case of Greece. And we've engaged in the case of Greece in understanding what are the pros and cons from Greece for countries like Sri Lanka now going through what was a partial default in 2022. All right, so I've asked the panelists to speak for about 3 to 5 minutes, and I'll flex up when it's 5 minutes for sure. But I think what we should do now is start the meeting and have some initial reflections from Ganesh. Over to you, Ganesh.
Thank you very much, Dirk, and it's a real pleasure to be back at ODI 18 months on from the dark days of the crisis. And I want to give you kind of a state of play update on where Sri Lanka is today. I want to try to make 4 points about this outlook. The first is Sri Lanka has shown quite a remarkable economic recovery since April 2022, And the default really in 2022, April, on $50 billion of external debt was followed by this really crippling economic crisis. We had a contraction of the economy of some 8%. We had mass public protests. We had the downfall of a government, of an all-powerful government in particular, under President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And then you fast forward to May 2024, where we are today, and it seems like a different country almost in some ways. The economy is stabilizing. There's signs of an economic recovery. Inflation has come down from some 70% in the dark days to some 5-6% perhaps this year. Foreign reserves are up to about 3.5 billion. That's what they call usable foreign reserves. It takes out of a particular swap arrangement that was there. And the exchange rate is appreciating, and moderate growth is possible. Now, the change is due to decisive action by the government headed by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was elected by a majority of parliament. And he raised interest rates under his government with the central bank, of course, and then the petroleum market was opened up to foreign competition, amongst other reforms. There was Indian aid of about $4 billion that came at a time when the IMF program was not in place. There was an IMF program, and tourism is recovering. So that's good news. But Sri Lanka is not out of the economic woods, however. And the question in my mind is, are we trapped in a low growth, high poverty, high risk scenario? So that's what the issue is today. And the growth projections are interesting. So I kind of looked at the ADB and the World Bank, because the IMF itself does not give a growth projection for Sri Lanka in its latest World Economic Outlook, which is quite fascinating. The ADB talks about 1.9% growth for this year. The World Bank talks about 2.2%. My own estimate is it could be, if we're lucky, 2%. Who knows? And then the other factor of this scenario is that poverty is affecting some 5 million Sri Lankans, or a quarter of the population. There is a deprivation index, which the UNDP has calculated, where the number is even higher when we take into account access to health and other things. And there's also rising child malnutrition. And this is all in a country that was a basic needs success story as early as the 1970s, right? So we were up there for our per capita income. We were a country that was admired right across the spectrum. And there is this reversal, which people like myself are very worried about. And then there are these risks to this moderate recovery. 1.9% ADB says, 2.2% World Bank, maybe possibly higher if you're lucky. Three risks I worry about. One is that the poverty and inequality is coupled with concerns about inefficiency and rent seeking, and this is translated into social discontent across the country. And that is obviously difficult in a crisis situation. And I'm sure we'll hear a bit about that from Phyllis when she talks about Greece and how that played out. The second risk is this high political uncertainty. We have presidential elections, which are expected in September, October this year, followed by parliamentary elections. And the issue there is no consensus amongst the different parties about what the economic program should be going forward. One or two opposition parties are talking about different kinds of economic policies to the ones that are currently in play, which is essentially the IMF program plus some kind of reform agenda. And they're even talking about renegotiating this IMF agreement. And we don't quite know what that means. Some foreign investors, the non-state FDI, if I can say it, are taking a wait-and-see attitude, as are some of the market makers. So there is that risk. The third risk is about debt restructuring process. And Sri Lanka has been lucky to get agreement in principle with the official creditors. And that's the Western countries, with India, with China and others. But the talks with the private creditors has proven somewhat difficult and more complicated. And the question really is whether the delay in getting a deal across the official creditors and the private creditors will lead to the IMF delaying their tranches after the election. So it's something for the new government to have in their entry, and that's a real worry. The third point I want to make is that given where we are, we need to think of at least a three-pronged strategy to try to get out of this crisis and put ourselves on a pathway to growth. And I'll just very briefly talk about that because I know Indrajit and others will talk about it. Sri Lanka really needs adjustment with a human face, and nuanced economic diplomacy if we're going to go forward. And the three broad policy objectives are try to earn more foreign exchange than we've ever earned before in the past, and try to grow, invest that in growth. Second, we have to reduce poverty, which is now a huge game changer in Sri Lanka. And then we have to take a strategic view on how we interact with rising powers, particularly India, which is in our neighborhood. The first one essentially means we have to try to make the economy much more friendly to tourism, to remittances, to exports and foreign investment. And macro management is one part, being more outward is another, and so on. And there is this issue there about state-owned enterprises and how much we switch the economy towards more private sector, and then cutting a lot of the red tape which is there. So those are some of the issues. And then there's this corruption vulnerability issue which has been plaguing us. So IMF Program Plus is very important there. The second area about poverty, there is a lot of debate about food security, and I'm of the opinion that we really need to try to ensure that for our population, because during the crisis there was a lot of suffering as inflation hit 70% and affected a lot of people. We have to import more food cheaply, we have to grow more food, basic food, we have to reduce post-harvest losses, and we have to also reform the social protection program that we have, a couple of those, in a way that's much more user-friendly and really targets the poorest. The last part about India is really that, we're sitting at 1-2% growth, right? And we are 22 million people. India is at 1.5 billion people, growing at 6, 7, 8%. It's kind of China in the early stages of its growth in some ways. And we really need to think about supply chains, particularly in South India, around the Chennai cluster, that is the manufacturing hub in India. We have to think about a comprehensive trade deal, which really brings high quality integration on trade, investment, and other areas there. And we have to think of multimodal connectivity. These are difficult agenda items. The last point, Dirk, if I can have 30 seconds, is that we need to really get a consensus across the political divide in Sri Lanka on this long-term vision to get growth. And we have to try to bring all elements of society into it. And we really need some kind of codified plan, and for the people to understand that this will be a long-term process. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Ganesh. Thank you very much. And also, you're very excellent sort of on this project that we've worked on, and I've didn't introduce my colleague, Dr. Fredrik Dahan, who is the director of Development Finance and Policy Group, and together the group, Development Policy Finance and International Economic Development, we're supporting you in your efforts to also support Sri Lanka. Really pointing out that there is some recovery going on, and we are miles away now from the deep dark days, which is really excellent news. But of course there are risks, and you mentioned some policies going forward which are really, really important. Now online we've been joined also by Suren Fernando, and welcome Suren. And Suren is the CEO of MAS Holdings. And it would be really interesting to hear from you how the recovery is taking hold, how you feel and experience the recovery from a private sector perspective, but perhaps also to hear from you if there are any remaining challenges that you think are really important at this stage, and also connecting to the point from Ganesh that his number one priority is that foreign exchange really needs to be promoted, and so exports, how are we doing on exports from Sri Lanka, for example? Over to you, Suren, and welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, I think from an industry or exporters perspective, we hope to think that the worst is behind us. And I think the recovery that we have seen over the last maybe 18 months ago is quite commendable. And I think this is being acknowledged by the international agencies as well, whether it's the IMF, ADB, World Bank, and so on. The FX reserves, the foreign exchange reserves in the country has also grown, I believe, to about 4 billion now, which is in a much better place than where we were certainly 2 years ago. Tourism seems to be doing quite well. And also, I think the foreign remittances has also stabilized now, gone almost back to the pre-pandemic levels. And this has really helped the government to build reserves and keep the exchange rates steady. Inflation is now down from its those peak levels that we saw again maybe 18 months or 24 months ago. but we must remember that the base level is much higher than what it was 2 years ago. And this is probably why we don't see a full recovery in manufacturing industrial exports. The construction sector is quite still depressed, and also in merchandise exports. Specifically, I think if I speak about our industry, the apparel and textile industry, what really impacted us last year was the global economic slowdown, where we saw almost all countries that are in apparel and textile exports experiencing almost a 20 to 25% reduction in business, the exception being Bangladesh. The good news is that we are seeing a pickup in our apparel exports, and hopefully this year we should be able to get back as an industry to those 5 billion levels that we had in the past. Having said that, the challenges do still, there are several challenges that are impacting our industry, and I believe manufacturing in general. The first being the high cost of production. Increases in labor and labor-related overheads continue to be a challenge. High power and infrastructure costs continue to challenge us. And of course, the recent somewhat reduction in the electricity tariffs will provide some level of relief, but not enough to offset the huge cost increases we saw over the last maybe 2 years, even with the depreciation of the rupee. We are in a very high tax regime, at least for us here in Sri Lanka. Corporate as well as the personal tax increases have had a significant impact again on our overheads and labor-related overheads, making Sri Lanka not probably as competitive as some of our other players in this region. Migration of talent was a huge challenge 12 months ago, probably in a better place than what it was a few months or maybe 12 months ago. But still, I think that loss of talent is being experienced. I think across all industries, most industries, and I would say specifically in the digital and information technology, spaces. Then, of course, something that's probably not within Sri Lanka's control, but something that's impacting us currently are the challenges in logistics due to the Red Sea crisis. We have seen an increase in lead times and in freight costs, and the uncertainty in the Middle East also continues to worry most of our customers who are in the West. In terms of policy reforms and changes, I think, as it was mentioned, the most important factor right now is stability. I think political stability first, on which we could build economic stability. We have been following a certain path over the last couple of months, or maybe even 12 to 18 months, and we need to stay on this course. We must realize that the situation is still very fragile and the economy is still very vulnerable, and there are a lot of external challenges that may influence us, and also beyond our control. So therefore, stability in the internal environment becomes paramount. And the question that will be foremost in mind for any potential investor coming to Sri Lanka would be whether the internal environment is predictable, and we must ensure that we do all what's necessary to rebuild that confidence. And as far as policy is concerned, I think consistency of policy and implementation of those policies is essential. There are various tax reforms that are currently under consideration. For example, abolition or removal of the SVAT, the suspended VAT scheme, which will be highly detrimental for us as exporters when cash flows are impacted. Then there's still the mandatory conversions that are in place, conversions of export proceeds, and this sort of limits the flexibility for us, to manage our cash. Providing infrastructure at rates where Sri Lanka can still be competitive. Like I said, for example, like the reductions in the electricity tariffs will provide some relief for us, at least in the short term. Doing business with Sri Lanka has to be made easier, and I think this is something that the Economic Transformation Act, or the Economic Transformation Bill, which I believe is to be presented in Parliament in one of these days, becomes absolutely important, and I believe it's a key bill under the IMF program as well. And what we've heard is that it aims to transform the economy to be an export-oriented, digitized one, really streamlining approvals and to provide incentives and support for potential investors. All this is well and good, but as we have known and seen in the past, the success will really lie in its implementation. And I believe, as far as policies and trade policies are concerned, the government should continue to push for favorable bilateral trade agreements and trade policies. For example, with Europe, we have GSP plus and the rules of origin. For raw material is something that is probably limiting Sri Lanka from really maximizing that opportunity. We spoke about India and the Indian Free Trade Agreement. We still have a quota of just 8 million pieces, and I believe authorities have been in discussion for 8 or 9 years now, since 2016. But still, I think it's been very tough and challenging to negotiate with India on better and favorable terms for Sri Lanka to really kind of promote our exports. The DCTA, so the Developing Countries Trade Scheme, that's currently being sort of discussion with the UK, also becomes important for us to probably promote our exports into the UK, which is still probably at a significantly lower level than where it should be. So there are certainly positives, and I would say, like you said, the worst seems to be behind us, but the journey of HEDAS is also quite challenging, and I believe the right policy reforms are absolutely critical for us to move forward and get to a better future.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, Suren. That's really wonderful. So mentioning that the worst is behind us, and also linking back to Ganesh's point that there's also thanks to decisive action on the basis of the government. But there are still some challenges there. High cost of production, for example, that you mentioned. That points to a really the importance of a competitiveness agenda that needs to be pursued. You point also to the political stability that is really needed to implement various areas. And then also mentioned the economic transformation bill that is likely to be presented to Parliament. So that seems to be really important to be focusing on that. And there are a range of bills that are being presented. Before I ask Indy to discuss, I just wanted to acknowledge the presence now of the High Commissioner, Rotita Lama. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll give you a little bit more of breathing space. So first I'll ask Indy to talk, and then you can then discuss it. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for coming to ODI. So indeed, there is a central bank act being discussed. There's a public finance bill being discussed now. The economic transformation bill. All really important to chart this journey from debt to growth towards economic prosperity. How do you see this? How can the recovery be sustained? What are the priorities going forward? Over to you, Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you for inviting me again. Let me start by saying, the title is From Debt to Growth. So debt is at the beginning of it. I'm going to leave the debt part of it to my colleagues in the advisory group, because I've kind of recused myself from the process in the last stages, so they can talk about that. Let me basically reaffirm what Ganeshan and Suren said about the improvement over the last 18 months. I think most of you are probably aware that we had a major economic crisis at that time, 18 months ago. But what is perhaps not fully understood is that we were on the verge of a massive humanitarian crisis as well. And the $4 billion that India infused at that time, but for that, we would have had a very serious humanitarian crisis, because we would have had difficulty. I mean, our usable reserves were down to $25 million when we declared our standstill on the 12th of April. And this is a country with an import bill of $20 billion and debt payments of somewhere between 5 and 6 billion. So, when you end up with 25 million of usable external reserve, that's clearly a crisis of massive proportions, and that 4 billion did help us to buy time. And since that time, the government has moved very decisively, to be fair by them, and have taken firm action, which has got to where we are now. But there is a caveat. In the past, we had 17, we've had 17 IMF programs, and on a number of occasions, we have done the stabilization pretty well. So we've got to pretty much where we are now. But then, and it's usually kind of tagged to the electoral cycle, things begin to fall apart. And the crisis, we have repeated bouts of macroeconomic stress. This is what we've had. That's why we've had 17 programs. So you need to ask the question, is there something different this time? And I would say yes, very much so. I'm not saying we've cracked the problem, but there is something qualitatively different, which is very important. That is that we are putting in place, or we have put in place in the case of the central bank, and we are in the process of putting in place in the case of the Ministry of Finance, clear frameworks for policy making, which are being embedded in law. It's noteworthy that the things that we are doing now were being done between 2015 and 2019 when we had another EFF. Just before this one, not just before, but few years before this one, from 2016 to 19, we had an extended fund with the fund. And these things about, the independence of the central bank, the new Inland Revenue Act, all that was done. And it was yielding results. In 27 and 2018, those were two of only 4 years when Sri Lanka had a primary surplus in the budget. So there were some results. Revenue went up to 14% of GDP, which is not enough, but it is the kind of figure we're trying to get back to now. The central bank, the monetary board, the central bank took a decision not to participate in the primary auctions for treasury bills and took out that channel of the most egregious form of deficit financing. And flexible inflation targeting process was being put in place, and there was a data-dependent, forward-looking monetary policy that was being implemented. And the results there were also that inflation remained within the target, etc. So things were working quite well. But then we had a dramatic reversal of policy. On the fiscal side, there were the tax cuts, and on the central bank side, that was sent from the Presidential Secretariat to the central bank that they need not pursue the policies and decisions that were taken by the previous monetary board. So they completely reversed a number of the decisions taken by the previous monetary board. So both on the fiscal side, on the monetary policy side, there was massive policy reversal. And that kind of contributed to the crisis. And this time around, the imbalances were much larger than the previous time. And the austerity that has had to be imposed was larger than on the previous time. So what is different? Why is this likely to happen all over again? And here, this is where the fact that the central bank act has already been implemented, and that prevents the central bank from indulging in deficit financing. It embeds flexible inflation targeting as the monetary policy regime. So these frameworks are now in place and embedded in the law. And on the fiscal side, the Public Finance Management Bill is going to Parliament on Wednesday. And hopefully the fiscal rules, the enhanced fiscal rules that are being put in place, will, on top of the Inland Revenue Act, which has increased personal, corporate and VAT, personal corporate taxes and VAT, all that will bring us to a better place as far as the fiscal outcomes are concerned as well. And as I said, what is different is that these things are embedded in law. Of course, they can be changed. They can be changed in Parliament, but you can't do it through a letter from the Presidential Secretariat anymore. So hopefully, that will give us better stability in terms of macroeconomic policies. Then on the growth side, when we liberalized our economy in 1977, the president at the time, J.R. Jayawardene, said, we have to export or perish. However, his government and other governments only were able to achieve very partial reform, and we have never been able to construct an outward-oriented, competitive, export and FDI-driven economy. We have gone nowhere near that. Our growth has invariably been driven by non-tradables, construction, transport, personal services. Public service doubled in size, that was counted as growth. So this is, can we make a difference this time? And there again, there is a possibility that we may be doing better than we've done in the past in the form of the Economic Transformation Bill, which is also on its way to Parliament. We can discuss it in the Q&A, I don't want to take up too much time, but the institutional infrastructure is also being expanded. There's going to be an economic commission, which will be at the apex in terms of implementing this bill, or this act, I hope eventually. And there is a International Trade Office, a Productivity Commission, a Research Institute, a separate institution to manage the investment zones, so the zones and the actual promotion and approvals are being separated. So there are a number of things. And the export diversification or export transformation and investment promotion have kind of been brought together. So there are lots of things in this transformation bill, and if it is implemented effectively, a big if, it's very easy to write laws, and our president, being a lawyer, understands a lot, is able to conceptualize the laws very well, but as a country, we have not been able to help him to implement things very well. Mainly because we haven't had a consensus in the country on these policies. Because our DNA is very much still a kind of a 70s, 80s, inward-looking strategy. That's in the DNA of the whole of our society. So until we are able to win the case in terms of advocacy, there will always be pressure to push back. Let me make two other points in terms of what we need to do. One is the poverty and the social safety net. As Ganesha mentioned, the poverty indicators have deteriorated significantly. The headcount in terms of absolute poverty has gone up. It doubled in a year, in fact, and it's now about 26%. And it was very much in single digits about 5-6 years ago. And the UNDP has just done a big study on the, the multidimensional vulnerability, and 56% of the population falls within that group that is multidimensionally vulnerable. Now, the Economic Transformation Act has certain targets in these areas and policies in these areas as well. So these have to be given priority. In terms of poverty reduction, I think agricultural modernization and SMEs need to be given priority. There are elements in the transformation bill to address these things, and they have to be implemented better than they have been in the past. And in terms of the social safety net, we have reformed the social safety net and introduced a new program called the Aswasama. The money has been tripled, and the IMF has actually got a condition which says that at least 0.6% of GDP should be allocated to the cash transfer program. So that is a good kind of advance, but it's important that it is not politicized. Previous cash transfer schemes have been politicized. People who didn't deserve to get the cash transfers got it, and people who deserved to be on it did not get onto it, and would deserve not to get it, got it. So that kind of stuff needs to be eliminated. I'm not 100% convinced that that's going to happen, because there's a bit of confusion that's come out in the rolling out of the Aswasama scheme. And we really have to depoliticize that. Then the other thing is handling corruption vulnerabilities. The IMF program actually has this as a pillar. It's never had it before in Sri Lanka, has it this time. And it is to the government's credit that it requested the IMF to undertake a governance diagnostic assessment. That the report by the IMF has been published, and that is also to the government's credit. And it is also to the government's credit that they have now submitted to the IMF a time-bound implementation program. But the next thing again is implementation. So we need to implement this. We need to, and the IMF also needs to hold the government's feet to the fire. This is not an area that, it's not their natural domain, and they're not always very comfortable in this area. So for them to actually keep the pressure on, it's very important. The whole of Sri Lanka, the whole of society in Sri Lanka indicates very clearly to the IMF that this is something that means a lot to them, and that these 15 recommendations, which are in the IMF diagnostic, do get implemented. So let me finish by saying finally, there are people in Sri Lanka, and I think elsewhere, who say IMF programs never get countries out of trouble. They just sink them into difficulty forever. Well, I say, look at India. India went to the IMF in 1991, major crisis. It has never been back again. It's not the IMF programs that are the problem, it's domestic policies. The Indians, there was a consensus between the BJP and Congress parties on the strategy going forward. And that consensus still holds. And India has never been back to the IMF. Korea, South Korea, I know Shamini always mentions South Korea and Thailand. So, there are countries which have gone to the IMF and got out and never been back again. So we need to make sure that these things we are putting in place now, these frameworks that we are putting in place in terms of macroeconomic policy, all the various elements of the economic transformation bill, and the focus on poverty and corruption, all that needs to come together. And if we get that right, and if we have a national consensus on moving this forward, I don't think we would need to go back to the IMF again, leave alone having to restructure our debt. I haven't said anything on the debt restructuring, but I think Sean and Shamini are better qualified to talk about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Indeed. IMF Plus, how to build on the IMF program, but also just highlighting how deep the crisis was, possibly a humanitarian crisis almost in only 18 months ago, 2 years ago. But that basically now it's getting better. You're more positive now. I think, Søren mentioned we need exports, and for that we need political stability. And you think also that this time is different because there are these frameworks that are being put in place, which is really, really important to provide some political stability, and also highlighting the economic transformation bill as well. So thinking about you need to really grow and grow differently in the future. All right, so I should now go to the High Commissioner, Rohita Bolavana. You have been, you have this distinguished career. You've been a foreign minister, and Parliament, I think, and you're now the High Commissioner to the UK. And you've already heard some sort of presentations, initial presentations, and really pinning hopes that this time can be different. So it will be really good to hear from you how you see the current situation, and particularly where are the government priorities now to sort of go on the journey towards prosperity and move out of the situation of indebtedness to transformative growth. So over to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Director and along with your colleagues across here, and my friends, and whom I know some of you very closely as well, and my colleagues from the High Commission as well. In fact, I must apologize for my delayed arrival here at the outset because we were caught up by two, what you term, traffic jams, so to say. But now I have learned how to navigate through because my colleagues left before me and they have just arrived now. So I think I was wise in finding my ways around in the city of London. One advice I can give is between 11 and 12, avoid coming through the palace. Gates are definitely going to get closed and the diversion is going to be much worse than what you ever expect. What is nice coming here was the fact that there's a Colombo building right across the street. I was looking for some landmarks for us to identify. Fortunately, we have found one right across here. Thank you, Director, for inviting me to a part that has been already discussed. And I think Indrajit, I listened to our former Governor of Central Bank, my friend, and he highlighted some of the areas that really triggered our way back into a level of degree of acceptability amongst your type of forums. We are here not to keep on deliberating in terms of what we do, to look at a path that is now being steered by our President, Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe. As you introduced me, my background being both in administration, in investments, and also in politics, and having held office in the cabinet. I had the distinction of being able to serve in a number of governments in Sri Lanka, starting from President Jawahar, going back to 1978. So part of the problems, if at all, may have been a contributing factor as to how we looked at how to tackle the issues of Sri Lanka, which I think the statistical aspects of today's discussion may come from the technical experts who are out here and also the panel who is joining us via virtual. But I would share how things went up to the point at which we got into these serious difficulties way back, exactly to be now, 22 months, short of only 2 months for Malian. And I witnessed that transformation as well. Then again, how we had a trajectory flowing in terms of reforms, which we are now speaking once again, because the economic transformation bill is coming before Parliament only in another 48 hours. So that was legislation that we ourselves have been looking at several stages of Sri Lanka's transformation, being part of a pre-parliament, starting in the year 1970. If I'm sure, in 1977, with the government of President Jia, we were a closed economy, we went to a open economy, much before our neighbors did so, and very well claimed by the West. And we had a flow of investors coming in because we created an authority called the Greater Colombo Economic Commission that had both the apparatus in terms of getting the foreign investments, in terms of bilaterals and multilateral agreements that we have entered into, securing the interest of the investor first. And with that, we created a geographical area between two river banks called the Kalni River to the Mawe Bank, that's beyond the Karnataka Airport. And within this geographical area, the total political, administrative and economic administration was vested in an authority called the Greater Colombo Economic Commission. And it was headed by late Upali that was a very successful business leading the country. And that triggered, for the first time, our economic drive in an open economy. That went to so far, today it is being transformed into the called the Board of Investment of Sri Lanka, which chairmanship I held in the years 90s myself, before I became the minister in charge of investments in Chandrika Kumar's government, and followed by Rajapaksa government, and then only I went into the foreign ministry. So having said that, having known what the country needs is being now addressed by the current president. 22 months ago, as I recall, and as I mentioned, I witnessed the so-called chaos, both in the landscape of Sri Lanka and that of in the administration, in the governments, in parliament, in the presidency, all. There is no secret the fact that the protesters were so powerful, they were able to get rid of the president of the country. Right at his doorstep, the protesters came, but in a democratic environment and that of peace-loving systems that prevailed, there was no violence that could have been directed and to disperse these crowds. So, but the president gave way and he had to leave office, voluntarily, so to say, and the office came into the hands of the current president. That again I was a witness, the transformation. Having done that, we had the economy as our Dr. Varsan went on to mention, where it stood. I don't want to repeat on the statistics that they on how much of debt we were into. The reserves were $20 billion, mainly enough for half a day's consumption. Having said all that, today we are standing at $5.4 billion worth of reserves, and now inflation has dropped from staggering 77% to 5.1% as at March figures. With addition to that, we also had the protest part. In the country, these are very interesting things how we have managed affairs. Now, that is important for us to look at how we are going to carve out the trajectory for growth. Now, in our protests, we had a staggering number of 12,000 protests within 1 year, 2022. Now, this 22 having a staggering amount of 12,000 protests in the country, dropped to around 2,000 protests in the year. I'll give the exact figures. 2,422 in 2023. 2,422 exactly. Yeah. I'm giving you exact figure. 9,158 in 2022 to 2,422 in 2023. Now, this year, those include protests for a lot of issues, maybe the strikes, maybe the other type of protest that comes in. In the year May 2024 up to from January, now we are only around how many protests? 800?
800.
Yeah.
827.
827 protests. Now, we are being a democracy, we allow protests. Right of protest is guaranteed in the constitution. So that's another side to our trajectory in terms of carving a path for development, economic prosperity, whilst retaining the institutional framework of all the facets of a democracy in its highest form. That is why even the transition from one presidency to another went through the democratic process, the constitutional process, along with the franchise of the people being respected, so that thereby we have really built in a good foundation in our democratic values and that of our governance pattern in Sri Lanka. Whatever the insurrections, whatever the worst form of terrorism that prevailed, but still we never lost our faith and our institutional faith. That is one highlight towards our greater prosperity in the coming months or beyond that, how we are to look at. That is one reason the international community has come our way to assist us, including the IMF, bailout we call it, the IMF engagement with us, which I would like to frame it to be, and also the list of items that have been laid before us for us to comply with, which we have to do because we believe in doing so. Not that there's a compulsion, could have resisted. There was not even a strong opposition coming from within the parliament representation, which has several shades and several areas of concern they sometimes express. But when it comes to IMF, our engagement, it has got endorsed fully. So that means we can claim this endorsement comes with the presence of the parliament and the people thereby. Then again, we are now moving into a trajectory that we need business for the country. I'm sure towards greater prosperity, growth, we need the engagement of the people in the business circles. Now, on my way here, because it gave me time in the car, I called the chairman of the Colombo, what you call the Chamber of Commerce of Ceylon. So Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and that is Mr. Pulangamun Duminder, who is also senior partner for Ernst & Young. Now he shared. I said, I'm going to quote you in the event you can share some of your own assessment, because it's a very important discussion we are having in shortly. And in that he said, yes, we are back to business, Sri Lanka. The SME sectors have started working more. Interest rates have started coming down below single digit now. So thereby, we are now looking at engagement with the business. Business was hitherto not to be found. People couldn't find a liter of what you call petrol, but they had to be fueled for how many days, about 2-4 days, sometimes parking their vehicles, pushing 1 inch by 1 inch in order to get to a petrol pump and get their fuel. And thereby the entire economy got retarded to an extent beyond comprehension, because even our fisheries, they needed the kerosene and the gas and the petrol in order for their boats. That never came their way. And the fisheries industry, agricultural industry, the plantation, you name it, all industrial sectors suffered colossal loss in terms of working hours and the time spent for generation of it. But now all that has got restored. And that is the major field towards our looking at the next stage of our development. And with that objective, the economic reform bill that is right before me, I could even share these things available in the internet. This is going to be a comprehensive economic institutional development bill for the country. We are amalgamating the Commerce Department with that of the BOI, Board of Investment, with all the other institutions that are gearing and that are meant traditionally for the development of the economy. Now we have, even if you take a mission like a foreign mission, we have the Commerce Department representation, you have the political representation, engagement, you have the community representation through your consultancy. Now we are bringing the entire commerce part of the thing with trade, commerce, investment into one body through which the driving force lies. Is a commission, independent economic commission, directing the affairs towards greater objectives that have been already set in that, including the contribution for gross domestic product annually, and the increments that are being expected is also being embarked in terms of identification within the framework of this economic reforms transformation. And that will, I'm sure, will have the endorsement of the House of Representatives on the 22nd. I'm not speaking too far from that. Now with this, with the type of the roadmap before us, President Vikram Singh is looking at wide engagement. He is looking at the sector that counts most in terms of figure in our economy. From the time of President Jawad, we were looking at an export-oriented economy. And we have been achieving it, maybe partially. But we didn't have the type of gear that because of certain interventionist issues, including the disturbances that prevail in the country, we couldn't treat the entire potential of Sri Lanka, totally because we were stuck for about 30 long years in a major conflict. We have come out of it 15 years ago. If I'm to quote Lord Cameron's statement, only on the 18th of this month, he said this is a country that has truly a vast potential, and all communities must come together to harness that. So I think with these remarks being made by the establishment in the UK, I would like to conclude this opening session and be associated with the distinguished panel here to share in terms of some of the other information you may wish to seek from me, arising both from my speech or otherwise for Sri Lanka as a whole. And thank you once again to have given me this opportunity to share my sentiments. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, High Commissioner. Protest down, we're back to business. Thinking about all the bills that are being presented, and also highlighting the fact that sort of the injury said that this time is different. What will you do to make sure that these bills pass and that they get implemented?
Yeah, basically bills will get passed because the majority of the House lies with the President's leadership. And in that is the broadest possible coalition we have thought about in the recent history of Sri Lanka. Though President has a single representative in terms of his own political party, but overall, the party, for him to become President, he got the mandate of all like-minded political parties represented in the House. And also, we are in a way well positioned because of a alternate the section of the parliament. The operation is led by a group that, of course, was part of the same party which President was the leader for. So with that, the same philosophy, the political visions, including economic aspirations of the people, are getting represented with a large block of the parliament. So I think the legislation will go through, and with the legislation getting implemented is what Indrajit correctly pointed out. How much are we having the tools and the type of work capacity and the competence associated with bringing this type of legislation into action. So I am sure the world has got to open up. Relationships have grown. What we lack can be easily picked from other areas of the globe, and we are there as a global player and a regional major player in the geopolitical sense of the location. And we have the West, we have the Middle East, we have the Far East, then coming to the South Asian cooperation. So I think we have the strengths to command our way forward.
All right, well, thanks so much. I forgot that you were also chairing the Board of Investment in the 90s, presiding over a period of success when the investment did increase. So
even I must just highlight the number of factories we opened during that time is about 600 there. Every week, I used to visit with the current president, who was the prime minister, to open 2 factories in the country. Every week we had a flow of factories coming in, opening up, and getting production.
Fantastic. We'll come back to you and also questions from the audience, and please feel free to add them to the chat. But we'll take 2 or 3 comments from the panel, and then we'll come back to you. Let's first go to Shamini Toure. So, I mean, there's a positive story here. We come out of the crisis, but there are also challenges. There's hopes that this time will be different, and we think this time is different, but there will be major challenges as well. So Shamini, maybe we can hear from you as well, from your perspective. What are the challenges out there, and what do you think are the major reform priorities at the moment? Maybe over to you, from your sort of experience of being head of the Capacity Building Institute at the IMF, having seen other countries as well, but also, of course, knowing Sri Lanka as well. We'll be very interested to hear from you, Shamini.
Well, thank you very much. I think the question that's being posed, transformational growth is exactly the right question to address, and the operative word is transformational. I mean, Sri Lanka is on our 17th program with the IMF, so clearly, despite all of what's been said, we have not achieved much transformation. We still export the same kinds of things that we exported 40 years ago. So, not much has happened, at least over 40 years. But this time, this crisis is different. Let me put it bluntly. If Sri Lanka is to avoid another debt crisis, and I think the risk is very high, it urgently needs to grow consistently and inclusively at a rate of at least 6% for at least another decade. And it needs to raise its tax ratio to at least 15% of GDP. It's currently at 9%, and it's, with much protest, gone from 7.5 to 9.5. We have another 5 percentage points to go. We should not underestimate the difficulty of doing this. But if we don't do it, the country will be caught in a debt trap, even after debt restructuring, because we will have a debt ratio of the IMF projects of 95% of GDP by 2032. That is an extremely high rate. Countries comparable to us in Asia, like say Thailand, they have ratios like 60%. And we have 95 after debt restructuring. Why do we need 14% of GDP in tax revenue? Because you look at the debt sustainability analysis projections, and even after debt restructuring, we will be devoting about half our tax revenues to paying interest. So there is a serious fiscal issue that needs to be addressed, but the fiscal issue reflects a lack of transformation in the economy. So we have to, I think we all agree, Sri Lanka needs to adopt a new economic paradigm, right? You have to move away from these state-led, inward-oriented policies fueled by public borrowing to something that is a new paradigm of fiscal discipline and outward-oriented policies. And I think a lot of the speakers are striking the same themes, and I totally agree. Sri Lanka's labor force is slowing down. Labor force growth is slowing down. So all this growth, I'm talking about 6%, it's not going to be easy because it has to come from productivity growth and investment. But I would say, and I think we all agree, it can't be public investment. The public sector is too indebted. So it has to be private. It has to be private investment, private sector-led growth, and market-oriented, like everyone is saying, and export-oriented, and inclusive, right? So basically the government, apart from raising tax revenue, I think has to reprioritize its spending away from subsidies, particularly to state-owned enterprises, and move towards healthcare and education and cash transfers to the poor. I think we're going to have to, one of the most important things, and people really need to focus on a little bit more and don't talk about it, is there's a lot of political interference in production in every aspect of economic life. And we have regulations that basically favor monopolies and oligopolies in the domestic market. So this is why we don't get exports going, because it is too profitable to export in the domestic market, and it's kind of difficult to compete in export markets. So we have to have a thing. I personally am not thrilled to create more bureaucracy to promote exports. We just simply need to shift the economic incentives away from domestic production towards exports. That's how countries like Korea developed. I mean, there are studies that clearly showed that it's not a matter of creating more bureaucracies and trying to get foreign direct investment. It's a question of getting your enterprises to shift abroad, and that may have to make it more profitable for them to do so. So one way to do that is to reduce the incentives to produce for the domestic market. And of course, we have to build a skills base for a modern economy. Our education system is not that great. We are good at producing a certain kind of illiterate, sort of basic literacy, but the problem is we need to have more professional and vocational skills to really be able to get to the next stage of development, right? I mean, to become an upper middle income country at least. So the irony of all this is that, the state needs to do less, not more. And it needs to do things differently. And the difficult challenge, I think, in Sri Lanka is to reduce the role of the state in the economy and to ensure good governance over economic policies, fiscal, monetary, trade, liberalizing trade, and the deregulation should be more towards promoting competition, not restricting competition. So to me, the fundamental problem, look, I'm going to be very frank about the political economy of what's going on. A significant part of our business elite benefits from protected markets, from regulations that prevent competition, and state patronage. Not all businesses, but a good chunk of them. And in return for these protection of business interests, these vested interests essentially fund the political parties and who vie for votes through patronage and populist and quite irresponsible fiscal policies. This has been Sri Lanka for 40 years. So I'm not the only one saying this, because the IMF diagnostic, and I'm actually going to read from the the governance diagnostic that was published in last September, just a couple of sentences. And keep in mind that when I read that top government official is IMF speak for government ministers. I'm quoting. Overall, current arrangements act to insulate top government officials from accountability. Government controls over key enterprises limit the ability of market forces to discipline government policies and rent-seeking behavior. Extensive government regulation in core sectors such as agriculture, electricity, and construction restrict market-based accountability and generate extensive opportunities for top officials to direct state resources to privileged private parties. So to overcome, in my view, overcome these vested interests and achieve better governance, we have to have some way of constraining future governments from abusing the public finances and gumming up the market forces to gain political advantage. So the country needs to establish robust legal framework and strong institutions, independent institutions, to promote good economic governance. And so, much of what needs to be done, I think the IMF program does a good job of strengthening the core macro institutions, the Public Finance Management Bill, the Central Bank Independence, that act. Basically, these things are mandated under the program, and I think, they're going to they have been done or will get done soon. But there are a lot of other laws. In particular, the state-owned enterprise law, for example, that is, I don't see it making progress. Cabinet approved a state-owned reform policy last year, among other things, to establish a Temasek-style holding company to privatize and oversee the commercially oriented state-owned enterprises. There are like 160 of them. There's very little conditionality in the program on trade, liberalizing the trade regime and increasing competition, domestic competition. So, to me, we don't need to create more bureaucracy to attract the investment. That's not how the Koreas of the world did it. They basically, in case of Korea, they subsidized cheap credit. That's one way. I don't necessarily think that's the way to do it, but basically it's just change the structure of incentives towards exports. I am very skeptical that creating more government bureaucracy is going to solve anything. I think there are serious, like I said, the governance has to shift towards macro responsibility and things like deregulation, while protecting things like environmental standards, food safety standards, and yes, protecting the vulnerable. So to me, I think we're going to have a serious look at the incentives in the economy, and also the fact that protected interests are actually making it very difficult to change institutions to be more private sector oriented, outward facing private sector oriented, and market driven. So I think this is where, the lesson I take from the IMF experience, that I had 35 years of, working on programs across the world. The lesson I take, and there were successful IMF supported programs in East Asia, in the Baltics, in Eastern Europe, and there have been less successful ones in Argentina, in Egypt, Pakistan. And to me, the lesson is that, it's up to a society to change itself. Outsiders can't fix a country's problems. So it's going to be up to us as Sri Lankans, so civil society and the liberally oriented business sectors, of which there are people who really, business lobbyists that do want to have a more open economy. We need to press for the legal and institutional changes to ensure good governance and to shift the incentives towards an outward-facing economy. So this is my view, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Shamini. So really important to be more outward-looking, I think, and also sort of taking on board this idea that the economy hasn't really transformed as much as we wanted to, so that in 40 years' time, the export basket, production basket hasn't changed as much, and that we really need to think about transformation, economic transformation. And maybe after we had comments, it would be great to hear your view also on sort of how these frameworks that Ingrid was mentioning, and that were based on his premise to say this time's really different, how these frameworks can help you, so if the implementation of those frameworks can be done in such a way that Shamini is suggesting that they're not creating more bureaucracy, but actually are lean bureaucracy, recreating what you did at the BOI, as it were. Shall we bring in Shanta first, and
of course,
yeah,
please,
and then maybe Phyllis, and then we have you respond. Shanta, so major challenges out there, put forward by Shamini as well for Sri Lanka. I mean, from your experience at World Bank, Shanta, you may have seen different countries managing reforms differently. So I'd be interested to have your take on how to manage all these reforms, how to make sure that these frameworks are being used. And this is like a really important moment that we are in for Sri Lanka. It's a critical juncture to really do something different. And really these targets that Shamini was also mentioning, 9% to 40% protected GDP rate, ratio, 6% growth. How can this be done? How can this be implemented? Shanta, over to you.
Hey, thanks very much. It's really nice to be back at ODI with old friends. So, several people have mentioned the trade liberalization that started in the late 1970s in Sri Lanka. And, it's important to mention that this was a spectacular success. It was actually a better success than in many other countries that liberalized trade. The economy boomed, growth accelerated by a good 2 percentage points of GDP, and the unemployment rate fell to 3% in the 1990s. Right? And I want to qualify something that Ganesh said earlier, that Sri Lanka managed to reduce poverty because of its basic needs approach. No, the basic needs approach, which started back in the 1950s and 60s, did not reduce poverty. What did reduce poverty was the spectacular growth following the trade liberalization of the late 1970s. Now, the lesson for that, which is consistent with what Shamini was just saying as well, is that when you liberalize trade, Sri Lankan entrepreneurs are accountable to world markets. They have to play according to world market prices. And what they've shown is that when they are held accountable to world markets, they actually produce. And there was this big boom, for instance, even in the garment industry. Sri Lanka used to have a domestic garment industry, a protected domestic garment industry. And there was a big fear that with trade liberalization, that garment industry would collapse. On the contrary, it boomed. Sri Lanka's exports of garments was higher on a per capita basis than that of Bangladesh through the 1990s until the multi-fiber agreement was removed. So to me, what that experience shows is when Sri Lankan entrepreneurs are held accountable to things like world prices, and the beauty of world prices is that first, they're competitive, and second, they're apolitical. There's no politician, and certainly no Sri Lankan politician, can manipulate world prices. What they try to do, of course, is to use policies to insulate people from world prices. But those world prices are actually apolitical. Now, if you follow that story about the power of accountability, of entrepreneurs being held accountable for a objective standard like world prices, the failure is that Sri Lanka has neglected to apply that to a whole series of other activities. And so let me just, in the 5 minutes, mention 4. Right? The first, and this has been a scourge of the country, is that alongside all of this growth, back in the 70s, the 90s, and even more recently, there's one sector that has been lagging dramatically, and that's the agriculture sector. That's been really the slowest growing sector. And then you ask why? Well, there is a law. It's called the Paddy Lands Act, which was instituted in 1956, 68 years ago, that requires farmers who lease land from the government, which is almost all the agricultural land, to grow only paddy. Now, paddy is the least productive crop, and it's the least lucrative crop. They could make much more money by growing tomatoes and vegetables and fruit, but they're not allowed to. So, and not surprisingly, these farmers are very poor. I mean, somebody, I forget who was referring to the food security crisis or the food security problem. The real problem with food security is not just that there isn't food, but that these poor farmers don't have money with which to buy food. And the reason for that is by law, we have constrained them from earning more money. So this is a no-brainer. You have to get rid of the Paddy Lands Act if you want to help these farmers earn an honest income. And what is that? That means you make farmers accountable to market prices. You don't force them to grow paddy, you let them grow whatever is the most profitable crop and let them make money. And as I said, the experience has been that farmers will rise to the occasion. There's no shortage of entrepreneurial spirit in the country to take advantage of opportunities afforded. Second is the whole series of subsidies that permeate the whole country. And again, Sri Lanka is not unique in this. I worked on the Middle East and North Africa, where subsidies account for 6-7% of GDP. Well, Sri Lanka is a little better. In 2022, they accounted for 3.8% of GDP, but that's still huge. And in particular, the problem with subsidies, both the electricity subsidies and the fuel subsidies, is also a failure of accountability. Because with the electricity subsidy, the electric company, the CEB, the Ceylon Electricity Board, is not accountable to the customer. They're accountable to the government who provides the subsidy. And as a result, you have blackouts, which constrain growth, which constrain domestic output, and you have a very dysfunctional electricity company. Even worse is the fact that 70% of those subsidies go to the richest 30% of the country. Now, if I told you we have a transfer program, Indrajit talked about the social transfer program. If I told you we have a cash transfer program where 70% goes to the 30%, the richest 30% of the country, you'll tell me to stop that program right away, cancel it, right? It's a huge waste of money. Well, this is that program. That's what you got. Now, we have to be aware that if you cut subsidies, it can hurt the poor, because even though they consume a very small part of the electricity bill, it's a large fraction of their income. But the way to do that, as we have done in Egypt, in Indonesia, in Jordan, lots of places, is you replace the subsidy with a targeted cash transfer. Now, we have a targeted cash transfer program, a so-called targeted cash transfer program, which is the Samurdhi program. Indrajit referred to it. The problem with Samurdhi is that it's politically captured. There's evidence that it's something like, it's supposed to be a program for the poor, but only about 40% goes to the poor and 16% goes to the rich, right? The top quintile.
Shanta, could you make
Now,
the final 2 points quickly?
Okay, yeah, no, just to say that you can solve that problem of the politicization by publicizing this information. Who gets the Samurdhi transfers? That's what we don't do enough of, is actually present to the public the capture of the safety net program. It's rather done behind closed doors. And again, my experience in other countries, in Uganda, in Indonesia, again, by making the transfers transparent. In Uganda, we increased the targeting from 13% to 90% just by making the transfers public. Okay, the last point, not the last two, the last point is on the foreign borrowing strategy. Because there again, there are two kinds of foreign borrowing that go on. One is official creditors and the other is private creditors. And I think the problem there is that the rhetoric seems to be, again, in the discussions, is that we shouldn't rely on these private creditors because they're, I don't know, rapacious, profit maximizing capitalists, and it's better to rely on official creditors. And I think it's the opposite. The best thing about private creditors, again, is that they want to make money. So they don't make decisions based on politics or geopolitics, for that matter. And we don't get into problems of getting involved with official creditors just for geopolitical reasons that get you into a debt crisis. And the nice thing about private credit is that the minute there is some fiscal impropriety, like the fiscal deficit gets too big, they punish you right away. Your credit rating goes down, as we saw in April 2020. This is the kind of discipline that leads to better fiscal policy. And there's evidence across the world that countries that go and open up for capital markets actually enjoy better fiscal discipline. So the key word is accountability. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Shanta. So accountability is really important. One final comment before we sort of open up from Phyllis Papadakis. So Phyllis, you've looked at the case of Greece, which has come through a crisis, but now it's doing really well. So the last few years it's been doing relatively well, but it's been taking quite a long time. maybe are there any some to-dos and not to-dos when going from indebtedness to growth that we can learn from? Over to you, Vince.
Thanks very much. It's been very interesting listening to everyone's comments, and the two themes that really stuck out to me are the twin themes of fiscal discipline and outward-looking policies. And Greece has really implemented both policies which encapsulate both. So there was an unprecedented fiscal adjustment that Greece engaged in. And although, like Sri Lanka, the export mix is more or less unchanged, so our exports are not as strong as our import demand, the outward-looking investment climate has improved significantly. So the FDI that's come back into Greece after the crisis actually is at a record level. It's at pre-crisis levels, and it continues to climb higher. So there's still work to be done on economic transformation that boosts resilient growth. There's still challenges with that in Greece. However, the investment climate and the ecosystem that's been created to attract inward FDI has clearly been very successful in Greece. And we have signs that actually the composition of FDI is also shifting. So I guess three takeaways if we're looking at Greece. One is that a prompt consensus around debt restructuring would have been useful for Greece, because there were delays around forming a consensus around debt restructuring. That was clear in the case of Greece. The second is that several years could materialize before resilient growth takes shape. That certainly happened in Greece because, again, a bit of a similarity with Sri Lanka, our growth was fueled by consumption, both private consumption and public sector consumption. And the degree to which we saw a rebound in growth was related to how exports were promoted and how the trade shift occurred. And then third, I would say, there was some discussion previously around adding more bureaucracy. How does sort of the government feed into the growth trajectory? I think in Greece, one of the keys to the success story has been the degree to which new institutions were formed to facilitate privatization and to sort of privatize certain state-owned enterprises. So that boosted, to a degree, it did boost the inward investment that the country saw. The degree to which the banking sector was consolidated and recapitalized, and the degree to which, again, certain SOEs were scaled back. One last thing is on digitalization. So there's a lot of streamlining of certain processes, and that's clearly been through digital processes that have been put in place. Still now, still to this day, the drive for digitalization is ongoing in Greece. I'll leave it there because I think we're short on time. So
thanks so much.
Yeah.
So prompt action on debt restructuring would have been better, right, in Greece, and sort of this link back to the decisive action that is needed. The opportunities that are there now. You meant about digitalization. I think it's a key moment also to think about digitalization. Maybe links to accountability. I think that also Sri Lanka is now also piloting with sort of digitalization in some of the ministries. Some really great discussion here. I'd like to bring you in as well, the High Commissioner, and then later also anybody else, and we may run over by a few minutes. But I think, so we had a positive story, and that's still there, right? So it's basically, we've come out of the crisis, and that is, in other countries, you may not have come out of the crisis. In Greece, for example, you didn't mention Phyllis, but there was like a drop of 30% in GDP or something like that, and that's not the case at the moment in Sri Lanka, which is maybe more than 10%, and now it's growing. So that is actually very good news. The other good news is that there's a lot of tension around it, and bills, and so that can make this crisis very different. But there are also some challenges out there. Shamini mentioned challenges and some other issues that Shanta was mentioning, and some lessons from Greece. So what do you take from the High Commissioner? It's a tall order, but it can happen, right? You can sustain these efforts to get into the recovery. You can make it be a lean bureaucracy to really implement the reforms that are needed. And there seems to be quite a bit of consensus around the room of things that need to happen, perhaps, although perhaps there wasn't enough consensus in the past. So we will be interested to hear your views on that, and any from the others from Ganesh, maybe in Greece as well.
Thank you very much for me to come in here. Let me share our own strength in terms of our historical factors, how we have overcome similar situations. Now we are talking about a period of 40 years since we entered into the trajectory of economic reforms in the country, bringing the private sector initiatives, a free economy, and to be engaging with the world on a what we termed as an export-centric economic drive. Now today the challenges for us basically not in terms of identifying where we should belong to. We have had enough and more test cases within Sri Lanka ourselves, having experimented in terms of what we have been doing. What we sometimes a little bit of retardation was due to certain intervening factors, which was, I would say, 1/3 of the country being affected. In terms of the growth trajectory, totally been not been possible because of terrorism, and also insurrections we experienced too at that time. And that is one good reason that led to our bringing the economic reform in terms of youth, in terms of how to get youth into employment. Now there was a special commission that was appointed in 1976, in 77, to study what we were wrong with our youth in the country, seeking various other means towards which they canvassed their grievances. Now this commission highlighted the need for employment generation. That is one reason why President Jawaharlal adopted the fact that we need free trade zones to bring in investors within a demarcated area, geographically, give them the best opportunities, both in terms of protection, both in terms of employment generation avenues, both in terms of securing their investments on a throughout basis, and brought both the legislative and the statutory protection that insulated these investments in the country. Now that is, first thing was to bring employment opportunities for the people. That figured well at a given time. By 1990, within the free trade zone of Katunayaka, just across the airport, we were having 87 factories located in an area of 500 acres of land, generating 93,000 jobs in one given location. So that is one example I'm citing. Now how do we go for the future? From my experiences, we did in fact what you term the reforms in terms of our export restrictions that were there. Way back is in 1990, no, in 2001, way back in 2001, and brought in the deregulation process. At that time, our president was also the Prime Minister, I was the Minister for Industries, and we deregulated most areas, but still there are some areas to be deregulated, accepted. We brought in the nomenclature in terms of the international customs ordinance worldwide, the global, in line with what we believe should be permitted within Sri Lanka's mission. So that were also done. Our bilateral treaties and FTAs that we entered into with countries like India was a major starting point towards bringing more imports into the country and creating more exports as well as possible. But we brought in the type of understanding within countries at a bilateral level towards which we could navigate our own judgment in terms of what should be there and what should be coming within the bilateral trade relationship. That also has helped us. Now, the reason most was the FTA with Thailand under the current president. And we are also looking at the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement with the United Kingdom, which I have sent the papers across. We are going to follow in line with what the United Kingdom has done with Kenya. Their economy is between the two countries, bilateral trade is about 1.5 million. We are now at exports alone is 1.1 million or so, 1 billion US dollars between, and our exports are largely in terms of the apparel industry. But we need to diversify it into other areas when it comes to the West. Now that's where we are looking at some areas that were not spoken enough here, I would say, maybe due to the time restrictions, like the AI. Now we are now bringing the digital aid to Sri Lanka. In fact, on the 13th of next month, I am accompanying one of the investors from the UK in setting up digital universities in the country, so that get connected to the overseas universities, and most of the courses can be found in the digital form. So that's a growing area we have identified in terms of bringing short of AI, but bringing the digitalization into the education stream of our country. Now, we also have not spoken here in terms of how the investment in the tourism is going to contribute to the GDP growth in our country, because that's a growing area. At the moment, we have gone from a mere 300,000 tourists in the year back in 2022 to 1.4 million arriving in 2023. 24-hour target is 2.5 million tourists to the country. Now the airlines we are trying to connect up, in fact from Britain alone back to Sri Lanka, we are asking more direct flights to be generated. Sri Lankan can't have the assets to meet the demand. So there's scope for other airlines to pitch onto that. And we are now exchanging notes how best we can connect up on the tourism side. Now coming to the investment again, agriculture. Correctly, in fact, Professor Devaraj went on to mention the restrictions on the paddy segment, where it's 60% of our land occupation lies in the paddy farming, but there again the lands are not owned by the state. Lands are owned by the private farmers, but sometimes they have been had tenancy system of what we practiced since 1956, the tenancy law that came into bear, where the tenant cultivated was given the right over the soil, whilst retaining the title of the owners for paddy land. But there are certain restrictions there. I agree with him on the other assessments that maintain, because we in order to generate more productivity out of the parcel of land, you need freedom in terms of what type of crop you are going to pick for you to cultivate in the given land area that it belongs to you. So I think we can trigger more and more reform associated with that. Along with that, we have the land reform law in the country where the plantation land is restricted in terms of land ceiling. Maybe that's also a hindrance in terms of large investments coming into the plantation sector in the hands of the private individuals. We have to identify these as positive one to be looked at. Again, then we come to the livestock industry. Now we have a huge area of livestock we are not tapped sufficient. And per capita livestock contribution in terms of dairy product can be huge. But we are now looking at privatization of our livestock holdings in the state to the private sector. In fact, already one or two investors have moved in that direction. Valuation process is currently on, and we are trying to get that trajectory right so that the larger section of the contribution to the GDP will come from these sectors. And also the fisheries, right from Sri Lanka, we have the huge the sea resources associated with fisheries and the seabed. And we are also part of the continental shelf demarcation, which have got additional area of seabed for Sri Lanka. So with all these benefits coming our way, we are open development, what you term, platform for many areas of direct foreign investments, including the AI coming into the fold. And I am confident with the correct framework that we are now laying, we have demonstrated what we are capable of doing, what we are going to execute. And in terms of capacity building, I am sure the panel will agree with me, we need capacity building, right? We can't leave it only in the hands of the bureaucrats that are currently associated in administration in some of the areas of bureaucratic responsibility. But when it comes to triggering our economy, we need to look at the capacity building as well in the individual areas of contribution that can come. The private sector will be, of course, invited both in Sri Lanka and from abroad to be part of our trajectory and our path for prosperity. So I'm sure we all have a hand in to play here, and I thank for the opportunity that was extended.
Thanks so much, and all these initiatives and various actions that you're taking. I just want to bring in briefly, I think, Indrit and Ganesh here, and then Frederick, and then we need to finish. So Indrit, so we talked a lot about the bills. This time's different. There was a demand for more accountability, more outward-looking. Shark needs to be more outward-looking. It needs to be more accountable. Are these bills going to help? How are these bills going to help in your view? And what do you think are the sort of next challenges there? And anything else you want to say, just briefly?
Yeah, but I think Heather was saying earlier, these frameworks that have been put in place and being embedded in law can be very helpful. But laws are only good as the people who basically administer them. So, but it is actually an advance to get that legal infrastructure into place. Now it is up to us. I think with Shanta, who finished off by, or Shamini, I can't remember, one of them said really, these turnarounds in countries are not caused by the IMF. We can't complain that we've had 17 programs and we are still going for IMF programs and blame it on the IMF. The problem is ours. We haven't been able to get our fiscal house in order. We have fiscal dominance in monetary policy. People say, with Einstein, right, who said that if you do the same thing again and again and expect different outcome, that's the definition of insanity. But we have been in that space, really. So we need to get out of it, right? So if we do, I think we're putting in place the building blocks, for sure. But we have to have that breakthrough. You asked me to comment on the central bank, which I didn't enough. Let me say this, I think the act has to be protected at all costs. There is a perception in the country that the central bank should be a development bank. That, it's there to support the government, to drive growth, etc. It is not. It is there to maintain price stability. That is its main objective. And also to maintain financial system stability. In my view, the central bank has been excellently in the last couple of years. It's been one of the really shining lights. It has brought inflation down from 70%. Now I think Commissioner is 1.5% in April.
Yeah, I quoted March.
Yeah, from March. And everybody in IMF World Bank, everybody expected a banking crisis. But it was able to manage the situation in such a way that, okay, someday there is some stress in the banking system, but we've averted a banking crisis. The World Bank was so convinced that there was going to be a banking crisis, they gave us $150 million to put into the deposit insurance scheme. But actually, thanks to the central bank, I think, and its ability, the governor and his whole team deserve a lot of credit. The banking crisis has so far been averted, and I hope we'll put that behind us. Final thing I want to say is really to reinforce India as an opportunity. In the 1980s, after the Plaza and Louvre Accords, Japan exported capital. They identified 4 countries. I was the finance minister's bag carrier at the time, so I used to take notes at meetings. And the Japanese ambassador met our finance minister, the late Mr. Onigan, and said, Mr. Minister, there are 4 countries which Japan has identified as investment platforms. That is Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Sri Lanka. If you look at what happened in the other 3 countries in the 80s, we missed out because there were 35 Japanese investors in Colombo when we had our 83 communal disturbances. They got on a plane and went, and we didn't get a cent of investment. So if you see what happened in the other countries, you can see what we lost out. Now, similarly, I think, if you look at what has happened when first Japan and then China had their growth surges in the whole of East and Southeast Asia, all the other countries in the region, not all, but some of the countries or a number of the countries in that sub-region were able to plug into those supply chains and move forward. Now, the history amongst those countries is not an easy history. You know, Japan and Korea, Japan and China, China and Taiwan, you know, there are enormous amount of commercial relations that go on. They don't allow, you know, emotion to come in the way. So we need to be absolutely pragmatic. India if we see India as an opportunity, I think that is the one thing that can shift our growth trajectory in a significant way. So clearly all these policies are important and get the right incentives, and I agree totally with Shamini. All that will in fact help us to increase productivity and get the right kind of growth path to move forward. But if we want a step jump in our trajectory, we want an accelerated growth, I think the opportunity of plugging into what's happening in India or what will happen in India over the next 10 years will be a big opportunity, and we need to study what has happened to the east of us to understand better exactly what that opportunity is. Thank you.
Thanks, and I really like these targeted pieces of advice that we get from all the panel. So central bank independence plus India from you. I think we get accountability from Shanta. Shamini, we go from fiscal consolidation and outward looking. From Phyllis also digitalization. Ganesh is sort of the figurehead of the project that we engaged in to support Sri Lanka and helping them from going from indebtedness to growth. What do you take from this discussion?
So I take really three quick points. The first is there has to be a lot more analytical work to underpin policy making in Sri Lanka. And I feel we probably haven't done quite enough independent analytical work. We're leaving it, you know, to the IMF and the World Bank and others. Not that they don't do good work, it's that there has to be homegrown thinking about the reforms. And I think the idea of borrower ownership has to be very strong in Sri Lanka. And I hope ODI, through our work, can support that process. And I think that's terribly important. The second thing, as part of that, is we shouldn't be doing work in ivory towers in isolation. We really need to be plugged into the domestic think tank system and also to some of the actors, the civil society organizations, the think tanks, parliamentarians and others, and officials, so that there are debates on thinking. And I think the High Commissioner was very good in bringing this experience of what was tried and what we learned and what we need to do further, and make people aware that there are some really important choices there for Sri Lanka. We are at a crossroads, make no mistake about it. The risk of serial default is something that keeps me awake at night. And I think we need to avoid that for future generations of young people in Sri Lanka. Very last point. Shanta, just on your point about basic needs success story, we will talk separately, but it's really about the 1970s, where plantation surpluses were used to fund free health, education, and food transfers. And that led us to have very high social indicators. And for sure, the reforms of 77 provided the employment-led growth. But the basic needs story with people like Sen and Eisenman and others, wrote about that. So we'll talk separately, but that was the point I was trying to make. That Sri Lanka was seen as a beacon, and there has been a reversal from that point. Sorry, that was just a sideshow.
All right, thanks so much, Ganesh.
Thank you very much. I know we overrun, so I'll keep that very, very short. I think it's been a really, really rich discussion. I'm keep oscillating between a sense of hope that there is almost a historical moment for the country to reinvent its economy and get on a growth path that would be sustainable. But at the same time, a lot of anxiety. Ganesh can't sleep at night around the social cost experienced by the country and the risk of not managing this transformation. A really important discussion. I hope we can continue. I just would like to really thank our incredible speakers, contributors for their openness, speaking very straightforwardly on those issues, and really enriching this discussion. Thank you ever so much, all of you.
Thanks, Frederick, and thanks so much for the frank discussion that we've had. And we're really looking also forward to be working with Ganesh, with local think tanks, but also just to support the process and any analysis that is needed to support the growth process. And we'd like to sort of shorten the time taken for Greece to get its export up from preferably from 13 years to like 1 year or 2 years, so that we get real results. And thanks so much also for all your examples and for coming to ODI. Thanks so much, panelists, Shamini, Shanta, and Phyllis, and also Suren. Thanks so much also for highlighting your challenges, but also the opportunities that are there. We really think that Sri Lanka needs to go to more transformative growth paths, and the private sector are really important for that. And sort of transparent frameworks, growth enhancing, growth facilitation measures are really needed. We talked about trade issues, the trade deals that are currently on the table. So there's a lot of opportunities there. Thanks so much for coming. Recording will be online, so you can look again at all the specific proposals that have come in and the wisdoms that have been put forward here. So thanks so much for coming, and hope to see you again, and possibly again do a similar discussion in 18 months' time when growth is 6% of GDP, and when the GDP ratios are higher, and when all the debt situation has been resolved. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we're